Thank you, Emily. I'm looking forward to talking with you today about what we've seen on the off-premise side of the industry during the last several months and how things look as we head toward the end of the year. As Emily said, we're a digital customer engagement company, and what we do is focus with retailers not so much on the transaction, but on helping retailers and brands find the right customers for their products and get them into the store, whether that's walking in the store or, as we're going to talk about here, a lot of the changes that have driven more people to shop online. But we are a marketing technology company that focuses on what we refer to as top and middle of the funnel, and helping find the new customers and the right customers for the brands and products that you're selling. Even before the COVID outbreak took control of the economy, we were already seeing big moves toward digital in the in CPG and in off-premise alcohol sales. And in fact, when you look more broadly at some of the data about consumer behavior online, the consumers are really the ones pulling the brands and the retailers into the digital world. About 70% of US consumers today shop online for one sort of product or another. And at the same time, when you look at manufacturers, about $2.6 billion of sales have been done online. That's only 1% of the entire off-premise industry. And retailers are probably the ones that are struggling the most to figure out what digital means to them and how they can reach consumers online. And that has largely been something that in the last 6 months has accelerated because of COVID, because of the economic changes, to the point where now you're seeing roughly $1 billion in online sales, but 90% of that is through wine. And roughly of 50,000 liquor stores that are out there, only probably 10 to 15%, even through all of COVID, have been able to very quickly and effectively adopt the tools they need to be able to do transactions online or to do curbside pickup. So this is an area that is still going to be a big draw for consumers, and it's going to be important for retailers to figure out. Interestingly, when you actually look at how consumer demand for Bev Alc product has behaved during this period from, say, March through now, we all know that there was a big spike toward the beginning, the panic buying of people trying to figure out how much alcohol they needed to have on hand at home to make it through this epidemic. But as people got comfortable and as people settled into new routines, the behaviors started to drop back into normalish behaviors. In fact, this chart here, the orange line, shows you from a Google search perspective, the level of people's interest in searching for COVID and information on COVID. And it tracks very neatly with both the peak in panic buying sales that occurred in the March, April timeframe, but also it drops off dramatically through the summertime, where you start to see overall sales begin to drop back to essentially normal levels post July 4th. On a week-to-week basis, there was variation, but you can see as we get into September, with the offset of Labor Day there, that basically sales have returned more or less to normal for local retail off-premise. One thing that has changed and has been the impact of this period of time and this crisis on the way people shop online. When you looked at local liquor stores prior to COVID, or even forget online, just the local liquor stores themselves, about less than half or less than 5% of all sales in those stores happen through online shopping. And the typical basket ranged from $25 to $35 in those stores. During the crisis, during those first few months of the crisis, the baskets jumped to about $125 to $150. And at the same time, we saw a surge in online shopping that it was anywhere from 25 to 45% of store sales occurring in the stores that were able to deliver that. But post-crisis, or I should say kind of in the late summer period, as things began to fall back into new normal behaviors, those basket sizes started to slip back, still larger than pre-crisis, but definitely half of what they were seeing during panic buying. And the number of transactions that were happening online also began to drop down as people were able to go back and walk in stores and shop the old-fashioned way again. But the underlying element here is that consumers have forever changed the way they think about online shopping for alcohol as they have for any other product. And in fact, when we look at surveys about behavior during this period, 70% of consumers now shop online, and most of them search online before buying. And this was an issue that the retailers were grappling with even before COVID and really hadn't taken time to address. I think they were kind of waiting it out to see when they actually had to think about digital as a part of their marketing strategy. But even more telling is that 75% of consumers changed their buying behaviors in the past 6 months. And that doesn't just mean shopping online. That can mean one of the things that we see happen is that more shoppers move to shopping big box and move to shopping in grocery for alcohol because they wanted to limit the number of trips. They wanted to limit the number of stops during the trips, and they wanted more larger stores so they felt safer as they went about their shopping. And this had a very negative impact overall on the local liquor store, particularly when it comes to retaining and capturing new customers. And it's estimated from a study by McKinsey that likely up to 80% will continue all these behaviors even after things begin to settle down next year. So, to kind of summarize the changes we've seen, the magic of the local liquor store has always been its size and its willingness to experiment with new products and to create opportunities for discovery, so that when people came in, they didn't come in with shopping lists. They came in to walk the aisles and find out what's new and pick up what they wanted and maybe add a few things to their basket that they hadn't thought about. And there was a focus on quality, and there was a focus on tastings and hand selling, and everything that we can come to love about the local liquor store has all shifted under this kind of current condition to a focus on availability. So now more of the big brands are selling faster because they have better recall in people's minds, and people are trying to get in and out of the store quickly. So they're not trying to find that hidden gem among a shelf of 50 bourbons or 50 tequilas. And they're looking for value. So they're looking for bigger sizes. They're looking for better prices. And they, as I said before, they're more willing to skip on the liquor store and just shop at the grocery store and switch categories because they feel it keeps them safer. They feel it's better for them to be in and out quickly. And that's had a big impact in the way that the liquor stores that have been successful in addressing this time have dealt with it, is by being able to shift very quickly to online, curbside, and delivery. This impact isn't just been felt with the retailers. As I mentioned, with availability, one of the fundamental shifts in consumer behavior in the last 6 months has been this unexpectedly large shift of people's buying behaviors to big brands. Some bigger brands that had been very mature and were on the decline had suddenly had resurgences because the brands came with good, easy recall for consumers, or they showed up in highlighted positions on websites so that when people were shopping, it made it very easy for them to fill their basket with the first things they saw that they recognized. And the impact of this for the craft distillers in particular, is one example, was a decline of 41% of sales in that period, and roughly $700 million of sales lost because they either couldn't get the shelf space or they didn't get the recognition by the consumer to be able to be competitive when it came to selling online. Now, I've said all that, but one of the things that we see in our data is a return to normalish kinds of behaviors. I mentioned in the earlier graph, you could see that our buying behavior around alcohol was tracking very well against people's interest in searching for issues about COVID. But even more importantly, some of the actions that have been taken in the various state economies, reopenings of stores and economic recovery starting to happen, has helped to counteract or reclaim some of the position that the liquor stores were looking to gain back from grocery and from others. And in fact, when you look at data post July 4th, one of the things you see in a couple graphs here, one where we look at um, average sales variation year over year during the period from post July 4th to now or through August, that with a half of a standard deviation, or basically 15% decline or rate increase in sales, 50% of all the stores in our network stayed flat during that time. And this has been consistent with similar reportings of other CPG environments as well. When you widen that to more of a 30% decline or increase, 72% of all stores stayed flat. And so what we're seeing now is post July 4th, things have really begun to settle down, and a lot of stores in most markets around the country are returning to levels that they were used to before. But there's some, when you start to dig into the data a little bit deeper, it provides some interesting views. In fact, when you look at the graph on the left here, this is a monthly look at year-over-year comparison. So for spirits, wine, and beer from March through August, you can see that spirits and wine held up very well during COVID. Right? It was perhaps easier to buy those online, or people were, again, going for value over in quantity and value over kind of normal behaviors, let's say. Beer didn't do it quite as well across the board, but all of them began to decline in terms of year-over-year growth in August. And a lot of this had to do with simply people were overstocked, right? They bought early and bought often, and they were kind of winding down their supplies. It was also a transitional month as we started to head into fall, and so there were some behaviors there as well. But where it gets a little more interesting, and I think where it's more useful from a retailer perspective, is to look at how the sales jumped back and forth month over month, meaning this graph on the right for spirits, wine, and beer, comparing the change from March to April, April to May, et cetera, et cetera. And what you see is a replenishment behavior, or this kind of boomerang, where people came in March, stocked up heavily, then didn't come back in April, then swung back in May and June, then didn't come back in July and came back in August. And so retailers have been going through this boomerang of inventory movement, and it's creating very unpredictable replenishment cycles for them, because they've been more used to burning down inventory over a number of months rather than this kind of surge happening every other month or so. So, there were a lot of negative effects, as we all know, from the COVID shutdowns. And one of the things it did do for the local retailers was to emphasize the prominence of other channels, be those other sort of brick and mortar channels, online channels, and in particular, a lot of direct to consumer and marketplaces that did well during this time, because they offered convenience and simplicity to the consumers that were likely to sign on to online shopping. It also impacted events and destination buying, which had historically been a staple of the liquor store. Concerts, events, summertime activities, all those things were fed by the local liquor store. And again, as I mentioned, restocking behaviors changed dramatically how retailers had to manage their store, and that was an unexpected and very quick change. But there have been some pockets of silver lining that leaned toward the benefit of the liquor store. Retailers who had already moved online and had established practices tended to grow over the period. They tended to have sustainable growth. They didn't see the boomerangs of activity as much. They continued to see growth that for some of them was exceeding Christmas time levels of sales. Buying behaviors also shifted up market, because the people who were shopping the liquor stores came there for products they knew they could only get there, and that they were picking up, and their other products were being picked up in other places, but they knew they had to come to the retailer for higher price, higher margin products, and that had a bottom line benefit for many of the retailers. Spirits, as we'll see in a minute, was solid throughout this time, and also hard seltzer really never slowed down, and it became a anchor for the entire beer category. One of the products that as health concerns became more and more prominent with COVID, and coupled with summertime behavior and more people getting outside, there was this kind of focus on what we call wellness or health products, and it was somewhat relevant. And it tended to be led by low alcohol content seltzers, clean wines, and organic spirits. Right? The trend skews really disproportionately to active and millennial segments. So when you look at the buying behaviors, the younger, more active participants tended to move to these healthier bulk products. But we still saw some resistance. When you look at consumers of beer, wine, and spirits, a little less than half still don't really care what ingredients go into their wine, and 44% don't really care where the grapes were grown. They just want their wine. So it's not a dominant trend, but it's a trend that's become higher and higher as we've moved through this year. So as we look ahead and think about October, November, December, and this important period of time for retailers of alcohol, we think about kind of how things are going to change for consumers in this time. And if you look around major cities now, even ones in colder northern states, they're all planning for restaurants to be open with outdoor seating and to try to get back to some, let's call it mid-pandemic retail levels. The June, July timeframe when people were starting to branch out to restaurants, and customers are going to come back to the mid-pandemic consumer behaviors as maybe new rashes of hotspots emerge and people start seeing winter impact health again. There may be rushes to more, if not panic buying, more stocking up that goes on than normal in the OND timeframe. But by all estimation, when you look at the sales behaviors over the year, we should expect to see pretty much OND back to normal levels, and probably in some certain pockets of the country surges because of response to COVID outbreaks and any sort of impact that come from regulatory changes of the states and the cities on consumer behavior. You can kind of see that as you look at these two graphs. And as I said before, spirits have been very solid. When you look at the graph in the upper right here, you're looking at a graph that begins in January 2019 all the way through September of 2020, October of 2020. And what you see for spirits in the local liquor store is that they stayed solid. And in fact, when you look at the first yellow bar is really the period of the summertime 2019. And when you compare that to the summertime of 2020, you see spirit sales stayed up, and you see that the graph, which is the blue line, and you see the graph of the orange line, which is beer, and the graph of the red line that is wine, look very similar. Beer a little bit reduced over 2019, but wine in particular stayed very solidly the same in behavior in those comparative periods. Where it's interesting is when you look at the kind of October, November, December bar in 2019, and you see the expected increase in spirits, the expected increase in wine, and the expected decrease in beer. Each of those are going to be amplified by the effects of COVID outbreaks and regulatory response to them. But in general, as you look at the graph on the bottom left, in particular the green circle that shows you that post July 4th return to normal, if you were going simply off of the behavior of the last few months, everything seems to be trending back toward a normal OND for us. So I would say the only real outlier here is for people in specific markets to be very aware of what's happening with consumer behavior because of reports of outbreaks or regulatory changes, because otherwise the current buying pattern suggests that we're going to have a normal OND across the board. But again, it varies state by state, city by city. So you have to be hyper aware as retailers of how your consumers are reacting to the things going on in their environment. So, as I mentioned, spirits, I just wanted to highlight some of the things about spirits that we've seen over the course of the last 6 months. Tequila really led the spirits surge and stability throughout this period. Whiskey is still the biggest, and vodka. second to that. But tequila showed the greatest growth, and it was the only one that had kind of a persistent growth across all 6 months in that period, followed by pre-mixed alcohol cocktails, which really suggested people were looking for those feel-good margaritas and those products that were easy to pack in a picnic basket and go outside with. All the other categories in spirits, except for brandy, showed growth during the early phase of COVID, and all of them, as we have talked about, started to drop off toward the end of the summer period. So if I can leave you with a few things here, it's great to look at the data and get all these trends, but what's important is to figure out under the hood, how does it affect your business? And ultimately that means understanding your consumers that are shopping in your store, and particularly the ones you want to bring in. And because you've got to look at where the margins and the opportunities are with the products in your store and figure out how to reach those consumers and get them in the door. Because the one thing you don't control is the decisions they make about where to go shop. But once they get to you as a retailer, you have a lot more influence on what they're buying and the products you make available to them. So use the data to find the right products and use the data to find the right consumers, ultimately get those regulars back in and bring some new customers in as well. It's going to be important now as retailers, as we get into this period, that we think about marketing our businesses in new ways, meaning you're not just putting products on shelves, you're not just hand selling wines and spirits to the consumers that walk in the door. You've got to engage them before they ever think about shopping in your store by getting events and virtual events and things that involve them in the discovery process in new ways, because the old ways of discovering by walking the aisles aren't going to be back for a long time. And in between now and then, we need to find ways to reach those consumers and give them the experiences and give them the exposure to the products that they're looking for in ways that really set you as the retailer up as experts in this area. And I'll wrap up here with 3 through lines that I want you to take with you from this presentation. I do expect demand to return to normalish levels, but again, there could be variations in that depending on where you are. I think from a retailer point of view, you need to look at that and track that really closely, because you want to avoid the bullwhip effect that you've been experiencing over the course of the summer, with surges in purchasing and then declines and then surges in purchasing that just left you holding lots of inventory much longer than you anticipated. Secondly, you've got to know your customer. At a time where your customers are now engaging you virtually or remotely and they're not coming in the store first, you need to find ways to meet them where their journey is starting and to take them through their journey and get them into the store to shop with you. And finally, I think from a product point of view, given where we stand with socially distancing and what we're expecting to see out of COVID, I think that the growth will continue for portable packaged products, not the big cases and things that are hard to move are not going to do as well until things start to settle down. So focus on products that consumers can, that give them the joy they're looking for and make it easy for them to transport. So that's all I have. Thank you.